This is a presentation that I gave in February at the UN, at the UNDESA headquarters, United Nations Division of Economic and Social Affairs. And it was me and Antonio Campo, who would not be here wearing shorts, I can guarantee you that. And I wanted to go over it because inflation was very much in the news. And I think that a lot of, so this group wants me to organize a little conference on inflation. And I asked her if it was too late. I mean, by the time we do it, it'll be the spring, and is it too late? And so I think there's still stuff to talk about inflation, especially since central banks are overzealous with inflation right now. So, okay. So as you know, inflation, and you know, when I said that, you know, the Phillips curve was flat, here's kind of the flatness of that Phillips curve. Inflation has been relatively tame since, you know, and even before. So for the past 30 years, inflation has not been a debate, an issue of debate. Be it from the perspective of heterodox economists. Oh, she takes my picture now that I'm in shorts and not before in the week. And she's going to send it around. Can you believe Rochon was? In Canada, we have a tradition of casual Friday. So people tend to dress a lot more casually on Friday. And so, but you know, starting in early 2022, inflation just skyrocketed and started coming down. And we know that today it's 2.8%. So it's quite a dramatic fall because it reached about 9% in Canada. So it was quite the unprecedented increase in inflation and everywhere around the world. And the issue that I have with inflation, and like I said, I've been having these almost daily exchanges with Lavoie and Sekerecia on inflation and central bank policy regarding inflation, and we have disagreements. Lavoie and I have never disagreed about anything in 30 years, and so here now we're disagreeing. And it goes to show that inflation did represent a very difficult situation for a lot of people. And this is sort of a longer trend view of inflation in the United States. And again, you see sort of like this flatness. And of course, this is the Volcker experience. This is the Keynesian regime that I was telling you about. This is the monetarist regime, the revenge of the rentier. And you can see here the tranquility of the rentier. And then of course it goes back up and it goes back down. Okay. We made a lot of talk. And like I said, central banks have been accused of not reacting, and they've been accused of being, I can't remember the word, not unprofessional, but dovish. Yeah, but even worse is irresponsible when they were not increasing interest rates. And like I said, increases in interest rates like we saw yesterday works only if inflation is demand driven. And even then, may not even work. But raising interest rates specifically aims at affecting those interest-sensitive components of aggregate demand. And so when central banks started raising interest rates, and then they started sort of arguing, well, inflation is bad, and we need to keep inflation low, in terms of two things, in terms of anchoring expectations, and the other reason is they were saying that people suffer from inflation. It makes it very difficult for people to buy, to consume food, and etc. And for the record, in Canada now, when we buy meat, chicken, or beef, it comes with an alarm. You know, in stores when they have clothes,
yes.
they have that now on the steak and the chicken because people steal them now. So it does certainly have an impact on consumption, and certainly an interdistribution via consumption. So lower income workers certainly suffer, and we all suffer from inflation. But as I've always argued, and we'll see it here, I think that inflation is manageable for the vast majority of people. I think what is worse than inflation is the policy response to inflation. So in the United States, this is something that came out a few months ago. This is a poll. And you can see Gallup, and you can see the number of people mentioning inflation as being a problem. It's only 17%. You know, and that probably corresponds to the lower quintile of the population. So they're massively are saying, you know, the bottom 20% are saying inflation is a problem, it's a big problem for us. But, you know, despite what we were saying, and the central banks and policymakers were saying, we have to fight inflation because it's it's the number one problem in America. This is not what the polls were saying. And most people did not think, the vast majority, 80%, 83%, didn't think it was a huge problem. For a vast majority of Americans, the number one problem was government debt. That was right around when government were talking about increasing the fiscal debt limit. And so that was for most Americans, because the idea is if you raise the federal debt, that means my taxes will go up and I'll pay more, etc. So but inflation was not much of a preoccupation. But, you know, the media certainly played it up. Remember, in Canada, there were stories about a mother with 3 children not being able to a single mother with 3 children not being able to buy food. And that's very true, and I don't want to minimize that problem. And, you know, that mother with 3 children is part of this cohort of people that thought inflation was a big problem. There is an economist in Canada, apparently a progressive economist, who was just won the best economist in Canada by the Progressive Economics Forum. You know, she wrote a series of newspaper articles calling the inflation monster and the year of extreme inflation. There's no way at 8%, and here I am in Brazil telling you that at 8%, reporters were saying inflation was extreme. You know, go to Argentina right now to look at extreme inflation. But certainly the media and even the left pushed this idea that inflation was the villain, was a monster, and was extreme. And so that sort of, you know, for me, gave fuel to central bank policy of increasing interest rates. And indeed, the governor of the Bank of Canada the day he increased, I think interest rates at around 3% to 3, pointed to this progressive economist and said, look, even the left calls it extreme, so therefore we're justified in our policies. And so, I thought that was very irresponsible. And I've quit the organization because I was part of the Progressive Economic Forum, and I quit when they gave her the Best Economist of the Year because I think she did a lot of harm to the left. Yeah, so this is from the Gallup. Americans mentions government as the most important problem, while inflation remains the next most cited issue, but only at 18%. So there's been sort of this, what I've called inflation paranoia, okay?
Brazil, they associate inflation with a dragon of inflation.
The drug?
Dragon.
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 Yeah.
Dragon of inflation, and everything, every situation of inflation, inflation here is associated dragon.
Yeah. Of course. Of course. Well, ouch. Where does this hysteria come from? This I've mentioned a few times. It's the credibility issue. Central banks must be seen as being credible, and they take their credibility from financial interests. The credibility of central bank as an institution, and this is what Epstein is saying, is they're not independent. They're dependent on financial interest for their credibility. And they must be seen as be doing something about inflation. And I've said this, that in March 2022, central banks were saying inflation is temporary. So there's no need to start raising interest rates. It will come down on its own. And it has come down on its own. It took a year, and a year is pretty temporary. And this is, in fighting inflation, central banks have a communication problem. They tell us we need to fight inflation because we need to help that mother with 3 kids buy food. People have difficulty buying food and feeding themselves, so that's why we're fighting inflation. Yet the policy of fighting inflation, I have so many of my friends who their mortgage payments more than double, in some cases triple. A good friend of mine, she used to pay $1,500. Now she pays $4,200. That's almost a tripling of mortgage. Another friend of mine, it went up by $2,000 a month. So, that's when I say, sure, inflation, 8%, and you might not be able to buy that bag of chips, but it's a lot better than having to pay $2,000 extra for 8,000 reais a month extra on your house. Okay, so this hysteria this inflation hysteria comes from the credibility issue, and in doing so, they have sort of a communication problem. So we've talked a little bit about this. This is the Rudd paper, the Jeremy Rudd paper. And there's been quite a few other papers that have come out and said that inflationary expectations don't matter much. And also the issue of the wage price spiral. That the Federal Reserve Bank, central banks are telling us, we know, and this is what they're saying right now, we know inflation has come down, but we are afraid of workers now demanding higher wages and leading to a wage price spiral. However, you don't have to quote silly post-Keynesians, you just have to quote the former vice chair of the Federal Reserve, the number 2 at the Federal Reserve, and now chief economic advisor to Biden. Despite constrained supply, wages do not appear to be driving inflation in a 1970s style wage price spiral. There is no wage price spiral. Okay? But central banks keep telling us that this is what they're afraid of, that this is the next round. And I know Mark Lavoie is saying the same thing. And they point to the fact that in Canada, federal government employees just negotiated a 7% wage increase over 3 years. But that's over 3 years. It's 2.5% per year, well within inflation. Okay. And again, the IMF has said the same thing, and you can see here, nominal wage growth is right about 2%. Real wage growth, again, around 2%. So there's no apparent wage price spiral. You know, I've said this to you. Inflation doesn't appear to be that much of a problem for most people at around 8%. This is a famous paper, Bruno and Easterly paper, that has been quoted all over the place. And Stiglitz says the same thing. Countries can manage to live with moderate, around 15 to 30% inflation for long periods. Now, it doesn't mean it's not a problem, but they can live and they can adapt, and not bad. In the paper, they argue inflation becomes destabilizing at around 40%. And this was confirmed by Dornbusch and Fisher. It is the central bank policies to reduce inflation that are destabilizing. This is what I've said. And this is a quote. Another great quote was from James Tobin that I mentioned, his 1974 in the New York Times. Hysteria about inflation may lead to policies that keep economic progress well below its potential. Recently, Joe said further interest rate hikes will have little or no effect and will cause far-reaching problems of their own. And what I called in another paper the weaponization of inflation. The weaponization is because we are weaponizing inflation. We are using it to justify an attack on inflation. Look, this is what I don't understand. Central banks have access to the same data as I do, as you do. And central bankers and their policy advisors are intelligent people. And they know inflation, this post-COVID inflation, was driven by other factors than demand. They must know this. Otherwise, give back your PhD. Right? So I know, I'm convinced that they know this. So I'm convinced that they look at the same data as I do. I'm convinced that they reach the same conclusions. And IMF and everyone is saying, oh, inflation is being driven by other factors. How do we go from that to increases in interest rates? I am convinced that central bankers know that interest rates don't have much of an impact on this kind of inflation. I know this. So it goes back. Why do they do it? And I think it's a credibility issue. That they cannot afford to be, there's two things they can't do. You cannot have a central banker come out and say, oh, raising interest rates won't have an effect. They can't. They just can't say that. Because if they say that, the markets are going to react in a very negative way. And I think that it's a paper that I'm currently working with, writing with Guillaume Vallet, is we argue a central banker, once he stops being a central bank, makes millions of dollars being on the board of various big companies, charging $1 million to give a speech, if he loses credibility, if Jerome Powell says, you know what, guys, relax, there's nothing we can do about inflation, he personally loses his credibility, not only the Fed credibility, his credibility, and he forsakes millions of dollars in potential revenues as he leaves the Federal Reserve and becomes a private citizen. So like I said, how much of this is due to monetary policy? Is there immaculate disinflation? And this was an expression that was coined by Paul Krugman in the New York Times. He says, we are living in a world of immaculate disinflation. If you think of immaculate, he's referring to the Virgin Mary. And she became pregnant, immaculate conception, mysterious forces. And this is what he's saying. He's saying, we're raising interest rates, inflation is coming down, not having a problem on output, not having an impact on output. We are living in a religious world of immaculate disinflation. I love the expression. I disagree, but good for him for coming up with that. But we know that it's been coming down because of special factors. Okay, Blinder's expression during the inflation of the early 80s. Now, the European Central Bank has come out with a paper recently, very recently, and you can't find that paper anymore. They've sort of taken it down. But they said every time interest rates go from 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 by 100 basis points, it only reduces inflation by 0.1. So here you do have a central bank that came out and said, look, it doesn't do anything. And that paper now has disappeared. Okay. And so, for the record, federal response to current inflation has been the fastest and most aggressive response in history. Look at the 1982-83. Even after interest rates eventually went up much higher, but after 15 months, it only took 6-7 months for interest rates to be at the same level this time around. And you have this type of same scenario. Interest rates today went up much faster, and even this is outdated because we are here now. Much higher, much faster than previous. So you can see this inflation hysteria in monetary policy. Okay, let's talk about the source of inflation. By demand, by cost. This is sort of the mainstream. Post-Keynesians usually downplay this. We think demand inflation, at least in industrialized countries, don't account for a major part of overall inflation. That the most inflation is cost push. So this is sort of through an Eichner markup pricing equation where prices of goods are set according to basic costs of production. And you have oil in there, you have wages in there, and you have other sort of costs. And then firms simply apply a markup to that equation. So you would have something like prices.
Break it. Yes.
So prices are not set by supply and demand, but you have a markup equation where M is a markup, and the markup, will depend on some sort of Kalekian view of oligopolistic concentration. And the costs, wages, oil. Now, if the markup is kept constant and the price of oil goes up, or if wages, workers, right, this is your wage price spiral. Workers demand higher wages, it will lead to higher prices, and hence inflation. The whole debate over profit inflation that Isabella Weber has pushed forward comes from the fact that this markup has increased, largely because of markets are more concentrated today, and they have taken, this has happened, oil has happened, pushed up prices, and in doing so, they've taken advantage and pushed up markups at the same time. There's a big debate, even amongst post-Keynesians on this. Marc Lavoie's blog from May was that, no, this is not the case. And it created huge controversy that you may be aware of. But I have a nice picture of Marc Lavoie with Isabella Weber in Rio, side by side. Who follows me on Twitter here? So I've put it on Twitter. We're very happy to see. Okay, demand pull, cost push. I'm a cost push kind of guy, kind of. For me, I much prefer the conflict inflation. For me, inflation is always and everywhere a conflict phenomenon. David Albright wrote a blog for me, and he says that in his blog, and I'm very upset because I'm the one who put that in the email. I said, oh, from Jamie for me on conflict is everywhere. And he stole my line and put it in the blog. But it's okay. But yeah, for me, it's always about conflict. Inflation is always about conflict. It's a distributional issue. And I want to make something clear. I was having a debate with Matthias Zanengo on Twitter, and Matthias is saying there is no conflict inflation because wages are not going up. And that bugs me, because that view of conflict inflation puts the blame of the conflict with workers. And Marc Lavoie used to, I convinced him now, but Marc Lavoie used to think the same way. Oh, the next phase of this inflation will be the conflict inflation. For me, conflict can and usually always begins with firms. Are you telling me that when firms succeed in pushing down, and my university, they cut our salaries by 5%? Isn't that not a source of conflict? But according to some post-Keynesians, they would go, no, conflict is if workers go on strike and demand higher wages. That conflict begins with employers. And in this context, especially when the cost of oil or the cost of other inputs go up, firms at that point have a decision to make. They either pass those costs on to consumers. Isn't that a source of conflict? Knowing that the real wage would come down. Or they can decide to, absorb those costs and, take a profit hit. But when they decide to pass those costs on to consumers, that for me is the beginning of, and then our real wages go down, and what do? We strike, we demand higher wages, but we're just keeping up. We're just trying to catch up. We're catching up. It's not conflict. We're trying to, catch up and get our share. And it's really funny because yesterday when I showed you that those quotes by the central bankers, and they say, you better not raise your wages. It's funny because when companies make 30%, the grocery stores, as I mentioned this week, 36% increase in profits year over year. 36%. And we applaud them and we say, oh, look at how successful they are. Yet if we demand 3% increase in our wages, we are blamed for being bad workers. And there's really sort of, I mean, I'm not a Marxist by any means of the imagination, but it's hard not to sort of go, damn, it's really a conflict-driven world. And so, for me, this conflict inflation, as I mentioned, applies to the open economy as well. It's not workers versus firms, but it's also oil-producing countries versus non-oil-producing countries versus... Okay. Conflict is always and everywhere. Inflation always and everywhere. Conflict. So demand inflation, you know the expressions, too much money chasing too few goods, inflation always everywhere, monetary phenomenon. In the United States, causes is Biden's fiscal stimulus, the long period of zero interest rates. This has been accused of fueling inflation. But that's only true if it would have led to increased consumption or increased borrowing for consumption, and that wasn't the case. Okay? That's not the case. And of course, the old pent-up pandemic savings. This is, the federal governments or those people who were working, we had savings we couldn't spend. We had an income we couldn't spend during the pandemic. So our savings increased during the pandemic. And you see that. You do indeed see the marginal propensity to save increasing during COVID. And the argument is, once COVID was over, everybody went out and shopped. And that pushed the prices up. That sort of confuses a few things. Prices are not set, but in neoclassical economics, the theory of price is the same as theory of output. It's one and the same theory. What determines prices? Supply and demand. What determines output? Supply and demand. It's the same theory. But in the heterodox economics, demand is output is determined by effective demand, and prices are set according to a markup. So then, if you spend, it doesn't enter into the pricing equation. Your wages haven't gone up. You're just spending. So it increases aggregate demand without necessarily increasing prices. So, these are sort of the mainstream views about, I'm concerned because Lavoie sort of buys into these pent-up pandemic savings a little bit. And that distresses me a little bit. But Lawrence Summers, the least responsible fiscal macroeconomic policy we've had for the last 40 years, he's referring to Biden. So pushing the idea that inflation in the post-pandemic era was largely driven by the Biden fiscal stimulus. According to Service Storm, if you don't know him, you should try to read some of his papers. He does really excellent writing. It quickly became plain that the conventional wisdom that roots the inflationary upsurge in the Biden stimulus. Yeah, so he wrote a paper for INET saying this was just not the case. Okay? Fiscal stimulus helps aggregate demand, great, but not prices. Okay. But that's the demand pull inflation theory. Current monetary policy thinking, as we spent this yesterday, it was all about the Phillips curve. And so the idea was that if output goes up, unemployment must come down and therefore must fuel inflation. That's the current thinking. And so monetary policy, so this is a repetition of what I said yesterday, the demise of the Phillips theory. And so that you need tremendous increase in interest rates to finally have maybe an impact on inflation. Okay. And these are sort of like troubling quotes for me. This is Paul Volcker, 1979, chairman of the Fed. The standard of living of the average American has to decline. Again, you know, when I was at the Bank of Italy in March, and I was April, and I was saying inflation is monetary policy is based on social classes, and it's like, how silly are you? And I showed them these quotes. I go, you guys are telling us that. Volcker is telling us this is exactly what it is. This is Jerome Powell recently. There will be some pain to household. Jason Furman, former chair of the Council of American Economic Advisors in the Obama administration, a very strange, peculiar fellow. To bring price increases down to 2%, we may need to tolerate unemployment of 6.5%. And I like the emphasis on that we may have to tolerate. And so for me, as a progressive, I don't know, call me what you want, unemployment is never an acceptable way of dealing with inflation. Because first of all, we know it doesn't work like that. Theoretically and empirically, we know it doesn't work like that. Second, there are other means. Even if it did, there are other means of dealing with inflation that we'll get into in a few seconds. This is a quote, again, it's just worth repeating because it's a beautiful quote. There's no empirical evidence for a 2% target. It's a professional embarrassment. Cost push, okay. So this is where I think the story begins. Joe Stiglitz, there is an overwhelming evidence that the main source of inflation was pandemic-related supply shocks. And I think that, as I said, I think that's a universal consensus now. Even in some like Financial Times article that I read recently, post-pandemic inflation was caused by supply shocks. However, we need to increase interest rates to bring it down. In the same sentence. And I had a little exchange with the guy who wrote it. And I go, you know, that makes absolutely no sense. And he literally replied to me saying, well, you know, I don't think the Financial Times would have paid me if I had written that. You know.
He really said that?
Mm-hmm. Certainly works to that effect. I've had articles turned down in newspapers because well articulated, well written, well argued, you know. But now with the Wall Street Journal article from this week out, you know, I think it's I'm going to use it as a way of saying, you know, yeah, I've had many articles turned down saying, oh, you know, you're just part of the fringe. That's the reason I started the blog, because no one wanted to publish my articles based on that, based on those arguments. And the blog was one of the first to say that in June 2022. Now it's, you know, Rethinking Economics came out with a similar argument, etc. But we were one of the first. Okay. So 3 sources of possible cost push inflation: oil and gas, bottlenecks, and profit margins. So and we see here how you can see the price of oil started to come toward Q4 of 2021. You can see that. You can see that. But and so this was definitely a source of the increased costs via oil. But you can see how it came down. And in 2023, it's basically back to where it was. So, and that's why you've seen inflation come down. I mean, this is the result of the war in the Ukraine, the restrictions on Russian oil, etc. But we can see now it has come down to basically pre-pandemic level. And as a result, so has inflation. This is the bottlenecks. This is, you can see the bottlenecks. Starting in June 20, well, a little bit earlier, you can see, this is December, right? COVID was March 2020. So you can see these bottlenecks coming, and building up. But we see them coming down eventually, and this is December 22, and now, they're back to where they were before. This is the cost of transporting by ship and ocean container. You can see they peaked in, I can't see this, September 2021, they started coming down, and look, now they're back to pre-pandemic level. And so you see two big sources of inflation, cost push inflation, completely eliminated. And this is another sort of supply chain pressure you see coming in again, March 2020, coming right back down. And finally, but one thing, you see the bottlenecks, you see the oil costs coming down, but one thing that's going up is this. What's been called profit inflation, greed inflation, seller's inflation, and you see the profit per unit of real gross value added of the non-financial corporate business, so non-banks. So you can see that. It started going up in 1980, and then just exploding in the turn of the century, and then again in the pandemic era. But it has been a trend well before COVID nonetheless. And people in the United States like Josh Bivens, in Canada, David McDonald, he's with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, a very good center. Jim Stanford, a Canadian, but in Australia, and Isabella, all writing on this aspect. And this is from David McDonald's paper, that you can see that what's in pink is sort of this explosion of profit margins. I like the story of profit inflation. I like it. As a narrative, it says, oh, inflation is not caused by workers demanding higher wages. It's caused by the corporations exploiting or greed or, I like the story. There's a big debate amongst post-Keynesians. Like I said, Mark Lavoie disagreed. He has softened his position. But, largely, go read Mark Lavoie's blog. He'll explain to you why there's, two reasons why he disagrees with market price, profit inflation. And so the question about profit inflation is has the markup increased? It turns on this. Profit inflation is defined as an increase in the markup. Firms increasing their markups given costs, or even because of higher costs, but they're raising their margins, right? Their markup. The question is, has there been increase in markups? That's the question. It's not an easy answer. In the oil industry, yeah, markups in the oil industry have increased by 1,000%. Conflict. Oil-producing countries have just raised their profits. We see that in grocery stores. It's not clear that there's been an increase in markup in all sectors of the economy or in the aggregate. So it's an empirical question, and there's going to be the need to do a lot of research on this. But interestingly enough, people believe in profit inflation. There's another poll that came out recently in the United States asking Americans what's causing inflation. Like 60% have said profits. And I was talking to Isabella, and I told her, I said, you realize what you've done. You single-handedly convinced people and the IMF and, that greedy, she doesn't like to say greedy, but I told her, I said, that's what it is. Greedy corporations. I said, fuck. Oh, by yourself you've done that. And it's quite a remarkable accomplishment. 86% of people believe grocery stores are hiking prices more than they should. I did some renovations at my house, and this was in February, March, and I went to Home Depot. You know what Home Depot is? And I bought hot lights. And I think they were $199 for a feet. And we said, we might as well put the same ones in the other room to match. I went back 1 week later. Last week I bought them for $199. This week, $299. I had this big argument with the manager. I said, how can you justify this? And he goes, I'm just the manager. I just put the price of the company. I sent an email to the company. I said, I've got a PhD in economics. Please explain it to me. Oh, I said, in 1 week, there's been a 50% increase. In 1 week, there's been a 50% increase in the price. Oh, they come from China, the cost of travel. And I sent them these, I said, no, look at the cost of transportation, it's come down. Don't tell me that. Anyway, he never replied to me. He stopped replying to me. But yeah. It's an empirical question. I think there's going to be a lot of work on this because I think that this work matters for the next crisis, or the next. Banks, this is just some sort of, and the ECB came out also, right, with a story about this, about profit inflation. They've acknowledged this. The Fed, the Bank of Canada has acknowledged this. But what I told Isabella last week, I go, it's fantastic. You've single-handedly convinced the world. And it's not an exaggeration. She convinced the world about the merits of profit inflation. However, I don't see governments acting, because she's been calling for, and others, taxes on profits. So the world seems to say, yeah, it's important. Do you have your cord? Oh, no. Okay, I'll give you money. Oh, thank you. My cord for the iPhone stopped working. I'm so happy. Thank you. And so the next step, it would be nice if you had some sort of institution going a step further and tax on profits, or, if I want an increase in salary, my union, we have to negotiate with the employer. Why can't we have, price negotiation units for telecommunications, for, why, In a free market, that might scare a lot of people, but that's called wage and price controls. I'm not a fan of wage controls, but I'm a fan of price controls. Because I don't think wages are the problem. I think the problem are prices. Conclusion 1. Inflation is coming down, unrelated to central bank policy, and we have to emphasize this. There was a story last week, I don't remember where, I wrote to the reporter, never heard back. I go, how can you say, oh, interest rates are going up, but it's bad, but it's necessary. Look, it's been successful. I wrote back to him, I go, no, it hasn't, come on. Never heard back from him. But it does lead to the question of, was this even necessary? Was this past year of increases in interest rates necessary? I think inflation would have come down on its own. And I think that's what happened. We saw the costs of transportation, the bottlenecks. We've seen the price of oil come down on its own. And I think that's why prices have come down. So I think this past year of monetary austerity has been unnecessary. That's the first conclusion. This is sort of the debate I've been having with Lavoie for the past year. He thinks interest rates have been too low for too long. If you believe in the Pazzinetti index that we discussed yesterday, a real nominal rate of the central banks were essentially MMT central banks, setting the nominal rates at 0. And I don't think that nominal rates of 0 are necessarily bad either. They certainly help in financing fiscal deficits. In Canada, the debt to GDP ratio went up to 400, from like 50% of GDP to 400% of GDP. But we had a 0 interest rate policy and it came right back down when people started going back to work, etc. But what is the proper level of interest rates? That's the question of the Pazzinetti index. So I think the monetary policy was unnecessary. Unnecessary. But it did have an impact nonetheless. Yes, income distributive. We talked about that yesterday. But apart from that, I think that inflation would have come down faster had it not been for the monetary policy. And this is something that we find in a concept called the Gibson's paradox. The Gibson's paradox means that higher interest rates are a cost of production. Companies have to renew their lines of credit, they have to borrow at higher rates of interest. Higher interest rates lead to inflation. The mainstream say higher interest rates lead to lower inflation. The Gibson's paradox says, no, higher interest rates lead to higher inflation through the markup approach. Kaldor, in the book, The Scourge of Monetarism, interest costs are passed on in higher prices in much the same way as wage costs. Goes back to Thomas Tuck. Okay? In his inquiry into the currency principle, a general reduction in the rate of interest a general reduction is equivalent, or rather constitutes a diminution of the cost of production. Low rates of interest lead to lower inflation, not the other way around. And again, this one, John Kenneth Galbraith, in The Affluent Society. Business firms feel the impact of monetary policy initially in the form of a change in factor costs or availability, specifically in the cost or availability of credit for capital. Large firms, right, because of oligopolistic concentration, are able to have substantial market power, enabled to pass this cost increase along to customers. How about this next quote? Gibson's paradox is one of the most completely established empirical facts within the whole field of quantitative economics. So higher interest rates lead to higher prices, higher costs of production passed on to consumers through higher prices on consumption goods, higher mortgages, and henceforth, if you're the owner of an apartment that you rent, higher mortgages means higher rental. And we know the price of rentals, I don't know about Brazil, but in Canada, the price of rental has skyrocketed. I own a couple of apartments, so I don't mind that. Yeah. Rents are part of the basket of goods, cost of living, standard of living baskets that central banks calculate in the cost of living, a CPI. So higher interest rates may lead to higher prices. So, yeah, that's an empirical question. It's not clear. It seems that higher prices after the war seem to come before higher interest rates. So it's not clear, right, after the war, if this is, Keynes was referring to this period. But there seems to be some sort of structural break here. But nevertheless, some people, a lot of the Italian Sraffians, heterodox economists, they've done empirical work on the Gibson's paradox, and they claim that it holds. Okay? Especially here in 1971, this is the only one that I've seen. It would be nice to see where this goes after 1970. In 1971, that's the oil crisis, and maybe that was some sort of structural break as well. So, I couldn't find anything for this, but I think the solution is here. Okay? But according to some Italians, and according to some other studies that I've read, there's one study at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York that seems to confirm Gibson's paradox. If that is true, then not only has the current past year of high interest rates affected the, the mortgages, etc., but they have contributed to preventing a further decrease. And I think with inflation in Canada at 2.8%, inflation would have been back to normal, up to 2% on target months ago, had it not been for monetary policy. I've said this, I am a big believer in cost push inflation, but I fear that it can lead to blaming the workers for wage price spirals. Robinson had this. Robinson blamed workers for inflation. So that's why I prefer a conflict inflation approach. I think it opens a conflict inflation certainly, recognizes the cost push, but I think it puts it in a more proper sort of context. And I think I'm pretty done with this. There's a couple of slides. And I think it sort of repeats a little bit from what I did yesterday. But I think there is something about profit inflation We need to do more empirical work, but it's a story that I like. Okay? So in Rio last week when I presented my paper on inflation, and I had Mark Lavoie, Isabella Weber there, Mark was not too happy. But Isabella came to me and hugged me. She goes, "You're saying exactly what I've been saying." And I go, "Yeah, I know. Don't say it too loud in front of Lavoie." Okay. So this, I think, is what I've done yesterday. And this is sort of the biases that I've talked about yesterday. This is 3 books. This has come out, The Climate Bias in Monetary Policy, The Class Bias in the book on income distribution. And this book is coming out. And I have to tell you, this book was tough to put together. Not a lot of people, last year when I approached people, now there's a few more people. But I'm hoping that it's going to lead to a legitimization of the issue of gender in terms of monetary policy and lead to more research. There's a lot of very good papers in here. The chapter on Brazil talks about the impact of monetary policy on exchange rates and labor markets from a gender perspective. And this, I think, is the last slide. You know, this is what I told you about. Look at the impact. So if I'm right, and if inflation is unrelated, if higher interest rates don't lead to lower inflation, but might have kept, inflation up, inflation would have come down much faster. This past year was for nothing, and it had severe consequences. Those higher interest rates, look at what happened starting in the Q1 2021. Look at that. The household debt service payments. Look at this. Look at this. A tremendous impact on household debt services. Canadians are the most indebted people in the world. We love debt. Households are super indebted in Canada, largely reflecting the ridiculous price of housing. But nevertheless, the increase in interest rates have had devastating effects on household personal finances. And so when I hear central banks saying, we've got to reduce the prices of food because we need people to afford food, people can afford food, maybe a little bit more complicated, a little bit more difficult. But what is worse is what central banks have. The solution to inflation has been a lot more impactful than inflation ever will be. And so, like I said yesterday, inflation is conflict-driven, sure is monetary policy the same. Okay? Thank you. Any questions? Yes. Let's have a debate. Come on.
I have a question about, I have a doubt question.
Oh.
How do they explain theoretically how the markup changes?
I'm sorry, how?
They explain in a theoretical way how the markup, because you said they study this in an empirical way, also. And in a theoretical way, because actually I can understand because the concentration of the determined sector of the company, but this conjectural changes, the markup that leads to higher prices, I don't get it. I can see in an empirical.
What's the question? Is how?
I think it's how can we explain theoretically that firms started to increase the markups during this pandemic? Why is that this happened now?
Yeah, so, good question. So, M is an exogenous area controlled, fully controlled by firms. It will depend on the degree of concentration in the industry. So if an industry is very sort of competitive, firms may not be able to increase N. Firms have been, the increased concentration predates COVID. And certainly the markup issue, profit inflation, doesn't seem to apply to the pre-COVID, so why now? The argument that I've seen, and certainly has been said by people like Robert Reich, is that as this is happening, and as inflation has gone up because of this, firms have taken advantage of the confusion. And it's interesting because when I talk to people, some reporters, when I read stories in Canada, some of them say, oh, yeah. I mean, some of my neighbors say, oh, food has gone up, it's crazy. Well, that's inflation for you. So they don't they accept the fact that prices are going up. They don't like it, but they accept it because they read that in the newspaper. They have people saying it's the monster and prices are going up. So they read about the oil and bottlenecks and driving prices up, and they accept it. And I think that amongst this confusion of what's going on, firms are taking advantage of that and pushing up their markups. That's the argument. That why are they doing it now? Well, because we've had no inflation for the past 40 years, and now something goes up. There's a whole generation of people who never knew what inflation was. I don't remember what inflation was. I was too young in 1980, when I was 16 in 1980. But, people who are 40 years old, they don't know what inflation is. And so now all of a sudden it goes up. People don't understand, firms are taking advantage. That seems to be the argument that I've read.
So are you saying?
But hold on, but that's an empirical question, and we need to prove that. And Mark's blog in May gave a theoretical argument against it. He says, no, M has not gone up. There's two things. Aggregate M, so M in the aggregate, and sectoral M. We know that in certain, and even Mark agrees, that in a number of industries M has gone up. And that seems to be undeniable. But does that mean that in the aggregate, because inflation is an aggregate concept, it's inflation in the economy. So we can argue, inflation in the oil industry, price increase, we would call it price increases in the oil industry has been largely driven by M. Okay. But in the aggregate, can we say that inflation has been driven by M? And that's where the debate is. So when Mark says at the micro level, yeah, this sector, great. In the aggregate, question. And that's going to be subject of much empirical debate.
So are you saying that beyond the issue of the degree of concentration, there is another issue, there is the validation of the rise in the markup, like the media, some of ideological issues that validates and people accept or not.
Yeah.
So, and I want to relate with another question that, do you have a paper or something that discuss the question of the conflict? That you said you understand that all inflation is related to conflicts. Do you have a definition of conflict or a paper?
Yeah, there's lots in the literature. I don't always. So conflict inflation is defined as conflict between firms and workers. So typically, when I do conflict inflation models, I will have a price equation, and that's the firms, F, and I'm going to have a wage equation for workers. And in here, workers will have a target wage share, real wage. Rothorn has called this the aspiration gap. What you target as your wage share and what you really have as your wage share. But if you're able to bring your wage close to your target wage share, okay, that means workers have power. They can demand the real wage they want. And in the pricing equation, very much like this, you're going to have 1 plus M, and you're going to have the aspiration gap as well. So the argument is, if you're at low unemployment, unions are very powerful. They can try to get close to their target wage. And if they're successful, this puts pressure on cost. And then, depending on this, and if firms are powerful, right? Powerful unions versus powerful firms. And that would vary by sector. But in the aggregate, this is what you're going to have. And the conflict is, who's going to be able to impose their power on wages or on prices. So that's a conflict theory of inflation. And that will depend on, the wage share versus relative to the profit share. And it's over the distribution of income. Because this will affect the functional distribution of income. So, so it's it's written in terms of the power, the relative power. And so that's kind of how the conflict inflation is defined. My problem is simply to say, okay, that's fine, but I think that you can have conflict inflation when inflation is zero or close to zero. And a lot of people were going, what are you talking about? I'm going, yeah. If unions are not very powerful and firms are able, there's another variable here where firms will have their target wage, what firms would like to pay. And this is what workers want to be paid. And if firms are able to impose this, why isn't this conflict? If firms are able to cut salaries, like I said, why isn't that? And therefore keeping costs down, keeping inflation down, and we have zero inflation. But I think that in the period where inflation was stable, that's still a period of conflict inflation for me. But some post-Keynesians, like even Lavoie, like I said, I've convinced Lavoie now, but Vernet go, no, we've had no conflict inflation. We've had conflict inflation because the wage share, real wage has come down. And that's been imposed by the inability of labor unions to demand higher wages because firms are too powerful and labor unions are not powerful enough. But that's still a dynamic of conflict. Just because labor unions have no power and all the power has been with firms, that's sort of a lopsided view of power, and that's for me still conflict. So I think Isabella Weber now accepts that as well. I've told her, because she had a diagram where she says, in conflict, inflation arises at the end. Yes. When workers, I'm going, no. And so she said that she's going to change that. She's going to say, I'm not sure how she's going to change it, but she said that she's going to change it. Question?
I also have a few questions. Okay, about this profit inflation, I don't know if you are looking at in specific place, specific country, but I wonder, I don't know if maybe Simone can help me with that. If in Brazil we have this kind of inflation, and I was wondering if it's possible to regulate somehow this profit share.
Well,
Because
yeah.
I don't know. I think that maybe it would go against the free market principles. I don't know, because it's easier, like here in Brazil, it's easier for the government regulate the oil prices here because we have Petrobras, and then it's a public enterprise, so the government has the power to regulate the profit shares and the prices. But for like the grocery stores, how can you regulate the profit margins there?
You're right. Any regulation goes against free market enterprise. But we don't live in free markets. Free market enterprise, I think assumes perfect competition. That's what we teach first year students. But we don't live in perfect competition situation. We live in oligopolistic. So this idea of free market is, companies in Canada being accused of price collusions all the time. So, there's, lots of abuses. We'd have to sit down and figure out, first of all, I'm not in favor of putting price caps on gas and oil. We have to find a solution to get people out of cars, not keep the price of oil down so that they can drive their car. That's, and I just recently read that even electric cars are not good for the environment now. So anyways, but for the groceries, what we're doing in Canada, and I think it's the wrong policy, the government is sending checks to households with limited income, whatever, so they can, buy more food. I think that's the wrong. I think that's not punishing the groceries. And I think that one way you can do it is simply, as you report your profits, if your profits are above, so 36% year over year, 36% increase in profits year over year. Let's cap that. Let's cap that to a normal profit rate of 20%. And everything above that, that 16% goes back into lowering prices. That would be one way of doing it. Oh my God, grocery stores would hate it, of course. Everyone hates regulations if it affects them. Regulations are only good if they don't affect me. But, we'd have to get a bunch of experts in there. But, even taxes on profits, for me, it doesn't affect prices of goods. You make too much profits, we're going to tax you. Okay, but the goods are still expensive. You got to find a way of keeping those prices down. And
So she asked about Brazil, if I know some data. No, I don't know any data. But Isabel Weber, she was here.
She works with Lucas Teixeira.
Yeah, they are working together in a paper on inflation. And she did her presentation on inflation. Is this idea of price sellers inflation, real inflation, that she actually doesn't like the expression.
Yeah, she doesn't like it.
Yeah, she used the expression sellers inflation, and she presented some data for important firms in the US, and that they are increasing their profits, and and she quoted some COOs of this companies.
Yeah. That state that directly.
Yeah, they say that yes, we when they are doing this quarterly presentations to the market in order to present the numbers and the balance sheets and everything. They say that yes, we are being successful in navigating during these turbulent times because we have been able to pass on the costs, and we have been managing to make profit in determinate sectors and something like this. And the market says, yes, wonderful, we're going to have more profits, we are very well succeeded enterprise. And she had a graph, also you probably saw that, with this, they are important firms. So if you go to the supermarket, you have to buy diapers for the kid and the toothbrush and deodorant and things like that that come from these important firms that they have been succeeding in increase their profits. So for the United States, I think much more research will be necessary, as you said, but this there are indications, good indicators, and like empirical material to at least suggest that hypothesis as a strong hypothesis. We have to consider that. We have to investigate on that firms are making more profit since the pandemic, because they in order to navigate these difficult times, they have discovered that they could increase prices more than the costs that they had. So they have different, this is a micro level, they have different strategies to operate in different markets and things like that. But in Brazil, I haven't seen any data. And that would be an interesting research. Yes.
Yeah. Let me just add that when I've argued in terms of price controls at conferences, some mainstream people would say, price controls maybe could have worked 50 years ago, but today, no. And I'm going, no, even more today, because markets are even more concentrated than they were 50 years ago. You don't have to control the price of 10 manufacturers of diapers, there's only 2. So it's much easier. And I think in every sector you've had this concentration, and therefore controlling prices would be much easier today than it was 50 years ago. So price control would be much, much easier to accomplish. Yeah, so whether you do it directly at the source of the good or at the grocery store, that's a question. But I think, that's the question that, look, I started the week with a quote by Keynes. And I said, anything we want to do, we can do. I believe in that. Price controls, okay, let's how do we do it? Well, let's sit down and figure it out, right? And people who are much better experts than me on the question, I'm sure could come up with, you put 4 or 5 experts in the room, they'll come up with many ways of achieving that. There was one guy who said to me, we're just going to try things. We don't even know if they're going to work. I go, you know what? That's what the pandemic was all about. We tried things, we didn't know we were going to work. When the house is on fire, you don't stop and say, what am I going to save? You have to get out. And, I think it would be much easier today to have some price controls. And companies would not like that at all, but I think, and let's not forget, inflation is not the same as price levels. The price of these goods will remain high. Companies will not bring their prices back down to what they were. Then you would have disinflation. We're not going to have disinflation. Since the Second World War, if you look at the trajectory of prices have always gone up. periods of prices coming down are very rare. So disinflation is very rare. Most since Second World War, inflation has more or less always been positive. Sometimes a little bit positive. 0 or 0.2 or 0.3. But this is still an increase in prices. So I'd like to see wages go up by 20% across the board. And then have companies and then applaud ourselves with, oh, look at how successful we are. We've got 20% increase in wages, and have companies and shareholders suffer. And for the record, I'm a big hypocrite because I own shares and I own bonds and all of that, right? But, you know, the theoretical person in me, but you know, I mean, I wouldn't mind if, you know, price of something, you know.
Yeah, you said that this policy that Canada adopted, and I really didn't know that Canada adopted that policy. I was aware only
What policy?
of Japan, of giving poor people money back in order for them to be like, more in a better situation, given the inflation. And you said I disagree with this policy because I prefer that they could control the price.
Yeah, of
but
course.
given that this is not done, I don't think this is a bad policy.
No, I
I
agree.
think it's a good policy because if the central bankers in the financial market say that we are doing that for the poor, we are going against inflation for the poor, then you say, no, stop increasing interest rate and let's give a cash back to the poor people for a while. It's gonna harm less than doing, you know, what we are doing, because you want to unemploy poor people. They are already poor, and you want them to be poor and unemployed. So it's a better, you know, it's a way to mitigate.
For me, it's a second best solution. But yeah, I agree. If you give them, I think it's $400 a month, depending on how many children you have, and it's on your income. But you know, yeah, of course, $400 a month. That's 1,600 reais a month to buy food. It's
It's important.
it's
It's
important.
very important.
Absolutely.